Hello there, everyone. Welcome to my review of Infinity Strash Dragon Quest: The Adventure of Dai, which is a bit of a mouthful of a title. Hopefully, it'll make a bit more sense once I explain why it is titled as such. But firstly, I want to give a big thank you to Square Enix for providing me with the game code to do this review. So big thank you to Square Enix for providing the code, despite my weird relationship with the Dragon Quest franchise. The reason I say my relationship with the DQ franchise is weird is because I have never actually played a mainline Dragon Quest game. Obviously, as most of you know, the mainline games are turn-based JRPGs. In fact, Dragon Quest pretty much invented the JRPG formula as we know it today. But I have only played spin-offs such as Rocket Slime and Dragon Quest Monsters. Dragon Quest Monsters being a monster tamer, kind of like Pokemon, but actually more similar to Shin Megami Tensei because you can fuse monsters together to get stronger ones. And as for Rocket Slime, that one's a bit harder to describe, so you guys can go look that one up yourself. It's pretty awesome, though. Anyway, I've always wanted to play a mainline DQ game, and I even bought DQ11 when it came out, but I never got around to it just because most of my game time these days is on the live stream, and even though I love JRPGs, I don't think they make for the best live streaming games purely due to how they're often really long and have a lot of dialogue and sometimes require grinding, you know? My point is that Infinity Strash continues this trend of me playing only the spin-offs because Infinity Strash is yet another spin-off. In fact, that's actually why I applied for a code in the first place, because specifically, Infinity Strash is an action RPG based on a shonen battle manga, so unlike the mainline games, I was expecting this to have very little downtime between the cutscenes and the combat, which would make it a pretty fun live streaming game, right? More specifically, Infinity Strash is an action RPG based on the 2020 anime, which is a remake of the incomplete 1991 anime, which was based on the Adventure of Dai manga, with the manga having been based on the Dragon Quest franchise in general, but not on any one game in particular. The manga has its own original story, just like how each Dragon Quest game has its own story and characters, but with common elements and recurring monsters, spells, items, etc. So, with the game being based on the Adventure of Dai manga/anime, it has to include the words Adventure of Dai, right? But you also have to keep the Dragon Quest moniker for the brand power. But you can't just call the game Dragon Quest: The Adventure of Dai, because then it would have no differentiation from the manga or anime. So the game had to have its own unique title in some way, hence the Infinity Strash part. So that is how you end up with a title like Infinity Strash, Dragon Quest, The Adventure of Dai. But I will simply refer to it as Infinity Strash from here on out, so you're welcome. Before I explain why this game is actually pretty fun and why it's a lot better than what some of these reviews are saying, I have to get my biggest gripe out of the way, but this is only going to apply to some of you, and that is because said gripe is regarding the performance on Xbox Series S. So I played the game on my Series S, and it did not run at 60 FPS. I don't think it's quite as low as 30 FPS. I didn't do any tests per se, I'm only estimating with my eyes here, but it looked as if it hovered around something weird, like 40 FPS or something like that. What's even weirder is that it's only really noticeable when you move the camera, which makes the environments look pretty choppy. So maybe for some reason the frame rate just dips whenever you move the camera around, but I think it's probably more likely that with all these anime-looking characters being animated with very strong keyframes, the low frame rate just isn't as noticeable on them compared to something that you would expect to move more subtly, such as a camera. Now, I obviously understand that the Series S is not as powerful as the Series X, but you have to keep in mind that this game has a Switch version, and regardless of the Switch version's quality, which probably sucks, but I'm not going to hold a bad Switch version against Square Enix because the Switch itself kind of sucks too. Regardless of the Switch version's quality, the fact that this game is able to run on the Switch at all makes me think it should be able to easily run at 60 on the Series S, right? Yes, it's an action game that sometimes has a lot of enemies on screen with a lot of particle effects, but there are other action games that run just fine on Series S, like Devil May Cry 5, for example, And the graphics in DMC5 are way higher fidelity, right? Needless to say, I definitely would have enjoyed my playthrough of Infinity Strash more if the game ran at a stable 60. I know it's not locked to 30 or 40 or whatever, because sometimes with seemingly no rhyme or reason, the game would randomly jump scare me with a smooth 60 FPS looking frame rate for the briefest of moments, and those moments weren't even necessarily when there wasn't much happening on screen, so I don't know what the heck is going on with the Series S version behind the scenes. But I heard from a viewer that the PC version runs just fine for them, and I assume the PS5 and Series X versions run just fine as well, so like I said, this critique is only going to be relevant to some of you. Basically, only buy the Series S version if that's your best or only option. Now, regarding the actual game design, this game is comprised of 3 modes, being the story mode, the Temple of Recollection, and the challenge mode. But before I talk about those game modes, I would actually like to now explain the combat, considering that the combat is what you'll actually be doing in each of these modes. Another reason why I want to highlight the combat now is because all the other Infinity Strash reviews that I have listened to seem to think that the combat in this game is shallow and not very good, or even a button masher, as I've heard some say. But I am actually going to call them out and say that they don't know what they're talking about and that they lack the literacy in action games to properly review one. I don't mean this as an insult. In fact, I think this sort of thing is to be expected to an extent whenever a franchise gets a spin-off belonging to a different genre than the mainline games. Because in these cases, you'll get a lot of fans of the mainline games reviewing the spin-off due to their investment in the franchise, but not necessarily their investment in the genre of the spin-off in question. So I think a lot of these negative Infinity Strash reviews are coming from fans of JRPGs first and foremost, who might not know how to properly engage with an action game, or at least not at a level that would qualify someone to review one well. I think this is especially evident when you consider how little time some of these detractors actually spend talking about the combat in their reviews. You'd expect that the action would be the main focus when talking about an action game, right? And keep in mind, I'm very picky when it comes to third-person action games. Even games as highly regarded as Bayonetta, I find pretty inferior to my favorites like Devil May Cry. The reason is because once you get good enough at the action in Platinum games, such as Bayonetta, you can kind of just get by with autopiloting. And if I can get by with autopiloting, that becomes very boring for me. Obviously, Infinity Strash's combat is not as deep as something like Devil May Cry, but I've realized over the years that I don't necessarily need a combat system to be super deep for me to like it. I just need it to keep me on my toes the entire time. And keep me on my toes, Infinity Strash did. So why is that the case? I'm just going to loosely, chronologically narrate my experience with the combat system and go from there. So, upon starting the game, I was actually concerned about the combat when I learned that all of the spells and skills are cooldown based. I suspected that the meta of the game would simply be to do your spell rotation and then, quote, button mash basic attacks until the spells come back. But this concern was assuaged when the game revealed that you can actually speed up the cooldowns. How do you do this? Well, of the aforementioned spells and skills, you can have 3 equipped at once, each one being assigned to a different button with its own cooldown, but you also have a dedicated basic attack button. By the way, you can remap the buttons even on console. That should be a norm for console games, but for some reason it's not, so I always like shouting that out when it happens, even though it should be a norm. Anyway, the basic attack button, if mashed, does a 3-hit attack string, but you might notice that there is a visible flash in between the second and third hit. This flash represents the opportunity to do what is called a just frame attack in fighting games. A just frame is an attack that nets you a bigger reward if you succeed in manually timing something or inputting something fast enough. In the case of Infinity Strash, if you manually time the button press for the third hit of the string well enough, the third hit turns into a different move entirely. It turns into a bigger move that does more damage than it otherwise would, but more importantly, it decreases all of your spell and skill cooldowns by a significant amount. This made me happy because 1, adding just frames inherently raises the skill ceiling, and 2, being able to figuratively vent heat to speed up the cooldowns means that the cooldowns are now, in a way, actually just meters being displayed inversely, right? A meter is something you would want to increase, and games with meters typically give you a way to increase them. Cooldowns are something you would want to decrease, so in having ways to forcefully decrease them, you can conceptualize the cooldown bars as the vacant space to an invisible meter. However, even though this one simple thing made me excited at first, once I acquired a sense of timing for the just frames, I was able to perform them with pretty much 100% consistency every time. And so I began to autopilot these just frame attacks in between spell rotations and thought, aw man, it's another autopilot game. But pretty much right after I thought this, I noticed that enemies would hit me and interrupt me out of the startup of the just frame attacks. And that's when I realized that doing the just frame attack as the string ender actually leaves a bigger gap in between the second and third hits than if you were to mash, because the just frame attacks have a longer startup than a mashed or mistimed third hit. That alone gives you a reason to actually think about whether or not you should do a just frame attack before doing it. So now, you can't autopilot, and it keeps the mistimed third hits from being completely obsolete. Obviously, if you wanted to do a mistimed third hit on purpose, it wouldn't be mistimed, you would simply be timing it early. But I actually found shortly after this revelation that there is something even better you can do when opting for non-committal damage over shortening spell cooldowns. And before revealing this technique, I should probably now mention that this game has perfect dodges and perfect blocks. A perfect dodge is a dodge that, if timed well enough, gives you some extra meter for the supers called coup de grace attacks, and can also proc certain abilities depending on your build. The builds being something that I will touch on later. Likewise, a perfect block is a block that, if timed properly, effectively acts as a parry, or a flawless block from Mortal Kombat in that it negates chip damage, which does kill in this game, by the way. And perfect blocking also staggers the opponent, which gives you enough time to get a few free hits in. Generally, the reward that perfect blocks give you is more valuable than that of perfect dodges, but it makes sense, right? Because perfect dodges are safer in that they don't require you to stand directly in an enemy's face, and even if you fail a perfect dodge by doing it too early, you at least get away unscathed, whereas doing a block too early leads to chip damage. That's just normal risk/reward balance. And like the just frame attacks, because the perfect dodges and blocks require a sense of timing, these also raise the skill ceiling, even more so than the just frame attacks, I would say, because the timing of perfect dodges and blocks are case by case depending on the enemy and what attack they are doing, while a just frame attack is always going to be the same timing no matter what, right? Another reason why I really like perfect block in particular is because this mechanic allows you to use pure skill to compensate for being underleveled. Basically, you can perfect block your way to victory against any enemy in this game once you learn their moveset well and become good at reacting to it. Which I think was a good design choice here, because a lot of action game players aren't that into grinding. And with that said, I will get back to the secret technique that I was leaving you guys wondering about. It's really nothing crazy if you're already familiar with action games, but I did not see anyone else doing it in their review footage or live streams, so I felt as if I had to highlight it to prevent it from being overlooked. Basically, I had to test if the combat was broken. I do this with every game. So once I realized that you can cancel the recovery of your attacks with either a dodge or a block, it made me think of a little game called Darksiders. I love that game. It's one of my favorites. Basically a Zelda game with God of War combat. Except the combat is actually kind of broken. In Darksiders, you can cancel the first hit of your attack string with a guard, and then you can immediately attack again out of a guard. So with a bit of practice, you can guard cancel the one attack over and over and go shing 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 and just melt boss's HP. You see where I'm going with this? I had to try that. Fortunately, in Infinity Strash, you can't cancel out of attacks early in their active frames, and you can't instantaneously attack out of a guard. So it's not broken like Darksiders, but you can still guard cancel the same way in principle. In fact, guard canceling the first hit of your attack string over and over Darksiders style does indeed dish out higher DPS than doing just frame attacks over and over. To boot, I actually found that doing the first 2 hits of your built-in attack string before guard canceling is more damaging, because the second hit does slightly more damage than the first hit, and the gap between them is about the same amount of time it would take to do a guard cancel anyway, and the timing is easier. However, even though 2 hits, guard cancel, repeat is more raw damage than 1 hit, guard cancel, repeat, there is still a place for both. Remember how I said that this game has perfect blocks, that if you time a block correctly and intercept an attack with it, that it'll reward you with a free window to do damage? By time correctly, that means you have to press block right before an attack hits you. And so that means the first few frames of a block are perfect block frames, essentially. Well, if you do 1 hit, guard cancel, 1 hit, guard cancel, wash, rinse, repeat, you'll be in the first few frames of a block for about 40% of the time, something approaching 50%, right? And so, knowing that, if you're fighting a boss whose moveset is unfamiliar, or if you are surrounded by a bunch of enemies and can't easily react to every one of their moves, you can do this trick when attacking and essentially have a 40% chance to automatically perfect block anything that gets thrown at you, even if you didn't actually react to it. In theory, not input-wise, but in theory, this is pretty similar to something called fuzzy blocking or fuzzy guarding in fighting games, which is pretty cool. But keep in mind that even though guard canceling inflicts higher immediate DPS than doing the just frames over and over, this technique won't shorten spell cooldowns like just frames do. And spells relatively do a ton of damage, so given a big enough amount of time, doing spells into just frame attacks, into spells, into just frame attacks, and so on would actually be the highest DPS possible. But opportunities like that will rarely present themselves. And therein lies the meta of this game's combat system, or at least what I boiled it down into. In any given situation, do you think you can safely squeeze in a just frame attack to get your spells back sooner? Or do you go for DPS in the present by doing 2 hits in between guard cancels? Or do you play it even safer and do only single hits in between guard cancels? It's pretty fun that you have to constantly evaluate that in any given moment. Typically, 2 hits into guard cancel would be what I loop by default, and I would switch to finishing with just frames to shorten my cooldowns when I thought it safe enough to do so. Or I would switch to doing only 1 hit between guard cancels when I thought it too dangerous to do anything more committal. Another thing to consider about the combat is that bosses in this game can have their poise broken, as indicated by a gauge that you can see while fighting them. When you manage to break the gauge and the boss becomes stunned, not only is it a big opportunity to get free damage, but there is a damage multiplier in place during this period as well. So you might think, okay, I should save my supers for when the boss is stunned like that, right? Well, not necessarily, because supers also inflict a ton of poise damage on that gauge. So, if you have enough spells off cooldown and at the ready to cash out some damage anyway, you might want to consider using your super to quickly get the boss into a stunned state, especially if you need a short breather to catch up on healing or something. Sometimes, bosses will even go into a sort of enraged state in which you can't damage the poise gauge for a while, but if you manage your rotations well enough, you can actually break their gauge before this happens and perform a sort of quick kill method, preventing them from ever getting a chance to do some of their signature moves, which is pretty rewarding to pull off. And this is just the basic universal gameplay. I haven't even talked about what the spells and skills actually do. One type of skill in particular, the Earth Slashes, I found that they have iframes for part of the animation. So if you sit on the skill and save it for defensive purposes, you can use it on reaction like a reversal to go through an opponent's attack without taking damage yourself. Other spells and skills include things that can shoot projectiles, destroy projectiles, or even inflict CC or debuffs, and a lot of them have AoE or piercing properties that you would obviously try to position in such a way to hit as many enemies as possible. So you have to think about your positional awareness as well. Speaking of these spells and skills, I would like to add that they all feel very powerful and satisfying to use. The game feel with them is very good. Also, I haven't said it yet, but the game looks so good, and the supers, the coup de grace attacks, they are all extremely well animated and well directed. It's really surprising to see just how great the camera work is in these supers when considering how this game is based on a 2D anime. And so if they were directly adapting a lot of these attack animations from the show, then I would assume most of the references would have been very basic camera shots given the medium. And if they copied everything one-to-one, then we'd have pretty basic camera work in the game too. But no, they really took advantage of the 3D medium here and worked that camera to make some awesome looking supers that never got old for me. One thing I'd like to praise in particular about one of the coup de grace attacks, it's a really small detail, but I love this sort of thing, so I have to let the devs know that I appreciate it. For the martial artist character, by the way, I'm not considering any of the party members as a spoiler when the key art for the game literally has all the characters on it. Plus, the manga has been around for a while now, right? But anyway, for the martial artist character, doing her super for the first time in a mission will see her remove her gloves, but the gloves stay off after that. And so if you do the super again, she won't do the taking off gloves animation because the gloves are already off. It's really cool to see some measure of continuity in super animations of all things. Funny enough, this reminds me of the Kick Me sign from God Hand, one of my favorite games ever, by the way. So for anyone who doesn't know, early on in a God Hand playthrough, someone puts a sign that reads, "Kick me" on your back, but it gets blasted off permanently as soon as you use the God Hand, which basically entails your strongest abilities. So as a flex, some people attempt what is called a kick me sign run, and that they refrain from using the God Hand the entire time, which is evidenced by the sign that remains on your back when you beat the game. So in a way, Infinity Strash has its own version of a kick me sign run in that, as the martial artist character, you can play through the entire Temple of Recollection, which is a mode I will explain later, while refraining from ever using her coup de grace. So when you beat the temple and people can see that the gloves are still on, that's your proof that you did it. Pretty funny, right? Another somewhat miscellaneous but more gameplay relevant thing that I was very surprised to find existing in this game is none other than a turning mechanic. And by turning mechanic, I mean that the characters literally have to turn around if you want them to move in a direction opposite to where they are facing. Kind of similar to Dota. They can't just instantaneously turn 180 degrees like in most modern third-person games. This is something you have to consider while playing, because even though there is a lock-on mechanic, if you shoot a linear spell at an enemy that your character isn't facing with their body, it will whiff. I started to notice this mostly when I tried waking up with a spell after being knocked down, as in I would try to mash a spell button while holding the left stick in the direction of an enemy and expect to see said spell shoot in that direction upon getting up, but it would often whiff completely. This means that sometimes in dicey wake-up situations, you'll have to quickly calculate if there's actually enough time for your character to turn before attacking. If not, you may have to forfeit a wake-up attack and simply mash dodge roll instead to get up as safely as possible. I haven't heard a single review mention this mechanic despite it being present at all times, but I kind of like it. I think I like it not only because it feels like something you would expect to find in a mech game or a game with tank controls, but it adds an RTS layer as well, which helps to set Infinity Strash apart from other action games. Additionally, some characters on top of everything have what are essentially devil triggers whose activation can interrupt bosses and be cancelled into, while the other characters instead have abilities to shorten cooldowns independently from just frame attacks. This obviously adds some more character variety on top of the different spells and skills that are learned as you progress, but you can vary the playstyles even further with builds. Character builds in this game are comprised of bond memories, equipable cards depicting different story scenes in what I assume to be panels from the original manga. While I do wish that a greater number of game-changing abilities were available through bond memories, like the one that increases XP gain, or the ones that add lifesteal, or the ones that shorten the cooldown on certain spells in particular, the ones that merely change stats, which are the majority, still end up being drastic enough to become interesting in their own right, because they can add up to such a point that it allows you to change the character's playstyles. For example, Dai, the main character, it's pretty obvious the devs made it so you can play him as either a caster or a melee attacker, or even a hybrid of the two. Hyunkel, he's inherently designed to be the tank, but you can build him more offensively instead. Mom, the healer, she can obviously heal, but you can have her focus more on offense as well if you want to have two damage mages on the team when including Pop. Pop being the premier DPS mage, and I would say he's the character with the most strictly designed role, but even so, when building him, it's not a matter of what role he should be, it's more so a matter of what kind of spells you want him to specialize in. The one downside to the bond memory system is that once you get a lot of cards, it sometimes takes a while to find the ones you're looking for. especially when considering that for some reason you can't save build loadouts in this game. That kind of quality of life improvement could definitely be added through a patch, but I don't know if this game is getting enough attention to merit patches. It's not that big of a deal though. What I take bigger issue with, and this isn't part of the bond memory system per se, but related to it, is that Infinity Strash does not communicate all the information that you would expect to easily find, specifically in terms of how damage scales. Obviously, some things are easy to figure out. Like, my assumption throughout the game was that anything whose damage was described as an element, such as fire damage scaled with magic, and that anything whose damage was described as physical scaled with attack. That would make sense, right? But then you have things like Fire Earth Slash. Regular Earth Slash normally does physical damage only, but the Fire version claims fire physical damage. So is that pure physical damage or some hybrid? And does it now at least partly scale with magic? It might sound weird to have a physically damaging spell that scales with magic, but some games do that, right? And also, I don't even know if it's considered a spell in this case because all the spells and skills, as they're called, are naturally found in the spells/skills tab. But when you open it up, there's no discrimination between the two types, so that's why I'm left to scratch my head figuring it out in the first place. If things were clearly labeled, I could just assume that anything labeled as spell would scale with magic, and anything labeled skill with physical. As such, it's sometimes hard to know if you're building a character with the correct bond memories. It's not just spells versus skills making me second guess myself though, because I didn't realize until post-game that Pop's basic attacks scaled with magic when, throughout the whole playthrough, I had been assuming that all basic attacks scaled with the attack stat, and that only spells, skills, and coup de grace could potentially scale with magic. I only found this out because there's a certain mission in challenge mode that pits you as Pop the Mage against a boss that takes normal damage from basic attacks, but pretty much no damage from magic. So I figured that if spells are going to do nothing significant either way, I should build Pop's attack stat to buff out his basic attack. But upon testing that, basic attacks were doing way less damage than before when his magic was higher. This means that not only do Pop's basic attacks scale with magic, but they still seemingly inflict physical damage. And that makes me reconsider if it's actually unlikely or not for some spells to scale with attack, as I was mentioning before with the Fire Earth Slash. Obviously, all of these things can be tested, and once they're known, but it kind of makes for a somewhat insanity-inducing first playthrough if you're somebody who likes understanding how everything works, like myself. Though what's much worse is that the partner AI is incredibly dumb. They walk into the very telegraphed exploding rocks, but walk away from you when you try to heal them. And when you need a heal, they're coy about giving it. This is especially bad when it comes to fighting the secret post-game boss, who has a near full-screen nuke, because your partners refuse to run for safety. So you have to walk one character out of the AoE, then switch to another character to walk them over, but when you're doing that, you have to hope that the first character you secured isn't going to move back into the danger zone. And there's never enough time to do this for everyone on a full team of 4, so oftentimes when you lose a party member, it just feels outside of your control. And while that does suck in a lot of specific situations, the lamest part in general about the poor AI is that Pop never meditates as much as he should when his reins are left to the computer. Remember how I said some characters in place of a devil trigger get a way to shorten their cooldowns at will? Well, Pop is one of those characters, and it's called meditating in his case. When playing as Pop, he's the most damaging character in the game by far if you can manage to meditate whenever possible. But AI-controlled Pop refuses to meditate and seems to always opt for basic attacks instead. This means that if you're rocking him on your team, you pretty much have to be controlling him as much as possible to not miss out on huge amounts of total DPS. That's fine if you only want to play as Pop, but it makes me a little disappointed that I can't play as Hyunkel in a full party without it being super unoptimal. I just really wish that this game had some kind of way to program your party's behavior. It doesn't need to be as in-depth as the Gambit system from Final Fantasy XII necessarily, but something similar to that would be nice. However, notice that my critiques so far since mentioning the combat, whether it be the lack of QOL, lack of info, or the dumb AI are not critiques about the actual combat per se. Rather, they're critiques about things getting in the way of the combat. If the combat weren't good, then I wouldn't be complaining about something obstructing it. My only actual critiques about the combat itself are that 1. When you press and hold block too early in an animation before the cancel window, even though you know you missed the cancel window, sometimes you would want to still keep it held so you can at least go into a block as early as possible once the recovery animation ends, right? Well, in those cases, even if you keep block held and expect to eventually go into a block, you actually sometimes won't. You'll just be standing around like an idiot thinking that you're blocking, and then you'll get hit and think that the chip damage is way higher than normal until you realize, oh, that wasn't chip damage. That was regular damage from a direct hit. If you want to avoid this, you have to let go of block and then press it again, which is kind of annoying. And then 2, I think you should be allowed to cancel out of dashes slightly earlier, especially on Dai. It could just be a placebo based on the animations, but it feels as if Hyunkel can cancel out of a dash just a bit sooner than Dai, but that's still not quite soon enough in my opinion. In fact, for the first few hours of the game, I was actually under the impression that you could not cancel dashes at all, because whenever I tried it, it didn't work. But that's because I was trying it based on where I felt the cancel window would be, which was actually too early. Obviously, both of these critiques are things that you can get used to, which I did, but they kind of stick out like a sore thumb when considering how good the overall game feel is with the combat everywhere else. Anyway, at the very least, I hope I'm making my case clear that the combat system here is worth a lot more than what the general reception would currently have you believe. So now that you know what the gameplay consists of and that it's pretty good, I can finally explain the game modes, starting with the story mode. Definitely the weakest of the 3 modes, which makes it unfortunate that this seemed to be the most marketed aspect of the game. It's also evident that this story mode is the only mode that a lot of reviewers actually beat, if any. And considering that, it starts to make a lot more sense why the game has a negative reputation right now. So what does the story mode entail? Well, it's a direct adaptation of the aforementioned 2020 anime, at least up to around the halfway point of the show's 100 episode run. Every now and then you'll get a 3D cutscene animated with the in-game graphics, which all look great, but the presentation between gameplay mostly consists of still frames from the anime with some voiceover, sometimes with a few animated effects, like on screenshots of fire attacks, for example. It's probably the most dry way they could have done it, and that's the one common critique from other reviews that I actually agree with. It's also apparent that a lot of stuff gets skipped in this story, but I would refrain from complaining about that because the decision was most likely made to avoid pacing issues that would otherwise be present. This story mode is only concerned with setting up a fight, having the fight, setting up a fight, having the fight, and so on. And this formula persists for 7 chapters, each one kind of revolving around a different villain that you encounter after beating some missions with regular enemies or sub-bosses. There are some gimmick missions here and there for the sake of variety, but they never lasted long enough to be anything more than novel. It's mostly about the end of chapter boss fights, all of which are really fun and memorable. But I would say for me personally, the chapter 5 boss is where it peaked. Not to say that the chapter 6 and 7 bosses are bad by any means, it's just that nothing after chapter 5 reached that same level again in terms of the ante, or the drama, or the build-up, or the attacks and animations that the boss does. Maybe it's partly due to the fact that I had been neglecting to manually level up my spells, and that they were all level 1 for this fight, which made it harder than it needed to be, but my point still stands. Also, I found out that the music in this game is directly from the anime, which explains why it's so weirdly good. And that obviously adds a lot to these boss fights in making them feel more epic. It's not by the normal Dragon Quest composer, it's by some other guy. I was actually going to say it sounds more akin to the You Say Run track from My Hero Academia, but as I was typing that, I literally decided to just look it up, and lo and behold, it actually is the My Hero Academia composer. So if you want to hear the best track in the game, look up Dragon Knight from Adventure of Dai, and you can easily imagine why that would automatically make any boss fight better. Speaking of the bosses, even though they weren't too hard with 0 grinding on the higher of only 2 difficulty options, I can say that they were a lot more satisfying than the ones in Armored Core 6, because most of the boss fights in Infinity Strash actually took more than 2 tries, unlike every boss fight after the Sea Spider in Armored Core. I only make this comparison because Armored Core 6 was the last thing I reviewed, and so it was still kind of on the mind while playing through Infinity Strash, and I was just surprised that an anime game like this had better bosses than a FromSoft game. Anyway, that review's on the other channel if you want to hear my thoughts. Be warned though, it's not really a comprehensive review, but more concerned with covering the contrarian side of things. Back to Infinity Strash, in terms of the length, I had about 26 hours clocked into the game upon beating the story mode, but keep in mind that the Temple of Recollection mode accounted for part of those 26 hours, and also keep in mind that a lot of those hours were cutscenes, the still frame ones, the ones that could be mistaken for PowerPoint presentations. I definitely would have preferred if the cutscene to gameplay ratio were a bit more in favor of the gameplay side, but that's where the other modes come in, and it's not as if they could have written in extra fights when they're directly adapting a pre-existing story, right? Regarding the story itself, aside from the lackluster presentation, it's a pretty typical, tropey shonen plot, but at the same time, it's kind of atypical in that it must hold a record for having the most amount of shonen tropes possible in a single story. I'm talking every trope imaginable, like amnesia, a chosen one with a special bloodline, plot armor, the power of friendship, a tournament arc, an obligatory small animal that's just kind of there, a technique so strong that it shortens your lifespan, characters sitting on the sidelines commentating fights instead of actually helping, and villains explaining their abilities so much that it reveals their own weaknesses. Things like that. However, even though I'm not a huge fan of shonen in general, since you can only rely on the power of friendship so many times before you lose me, I actually did find myself invested in the story of Infinity Strash, and I think that's because it's kind of refreshing to see something so unabashedly tropey that it doesn't even care. Also, considering how old the manga is, it kind of gets a free pass in my book. The Dragon Quest games are responsible for a lot of the tropes found in subsequent JRPGs, so I wouldn't be surprised if the Dragon Quest manga were likewise responsible in creating a lot of tropes in its medium as well. The only downside with the storyline in this game is that, like I said, it only covers the first half of the show, so it ends kind of abruptly after the final boss without much of a real conclusion, and that makes me wonder who the target audience was, because someone who's seen the show already will probably skip most of the cutscenes, and to someone who has not watched the show or read the manga, like myself, it feels as if the cliffhanger ending is there like a commercial to get you into watching the show to see the whole thing. But because the presentation up to that point felt like reading Spark Notes instead of actually watching an anime, the game is basically a spoiler for the first half of the show, which kind of de-incentivizes me from watching it, so I don't know. You may have noticed that I have mentioned nothing about exploration, which shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, with this being an action game based on a shonen battle manga. But would you believe me if I told you that a lot of other reviews actually criticized the game for this? Yeah, I guess they don't know what a spin-off is. Now, if you know your tastes and only like playing games with certain elements, like exploration, that's fine. But please don't hold the nature of a genre you don't even like against itself. Nothing in the game's marketing showed any kind of exploration, so I don't know why anybody would have expected it. An actual, legitimate critique of the gameplay, specifically in the story mode, is that there's this stupid little gold slime. Remember when I was listing the story tropes, I said something about an obligatory small animal? Yeah, that one. There's this stupid little gold slime that automatically heals you when you drop below a certain HP threshold after dying a few times. Obviously, that's super patronizing, and I wish you could turn it off, but fortunately, like I said, even with there being only 2 difficulty options, the story mode is challenging enough that I kind of secretly liked the gold slime healing me sometimes, but I still wish there were an extra difficulty mode without him. Also, I wish there were a retry option in the pause menu, And this isn't an issue exclusive to the story mode like the gold slime is, because I wish you could hit retry in the challenge mode as well. But obviously, with a lot of these boss fights taking more than several attempts, getting hit a bunch will oftentimes make you want a full redo instead of playing it out. Especially if you're like me and try to lab optimal starts for the first few moves in a fight, at least before the boss AI gets too unpredictable. However, like I said, story mode is the weakest of the 3 modes, and as I've been somewhat alluding, literally every complaint specific to the story mode is either fixed or made obsolete in the Temple of Recollection. Now, the Temple of Recollection is the best part of the game, and despite being advertised as a little side mode, is actually the main reason to buy the game, in that this is where you will spend the majority of your playtime. It's a roguelike dungeon that becomes accessible once a certain amount of progress is made in the story mode, and as you progress further in the story mode, the Temple of Recollection opens up more and more. This makes the temple something to be played concurrently with the story mode, because it essentially offers another way to grind. Not for XP, but for additional bond memories and resources to upgrade your spells. In fact, some bond memories can only be gotten here. However, I wouldn't really call this grinding per se. As I said, this is the best part of the game, so it actually began to feel as if the story mode was a means to unlock more of the temple, not the other way around. Keep in mind that even though you can grind this mode for bond memories and spell upgrades, there is an extraction shooter element. If you die in the temple, you don't get to keep any of the stuff you found, aside from amber, which is the main currency for buying things here. If you want to actually keep all of your spoils, then you need to reach the maximum depth available at the time, or bail out early at a checkpoint found after every 5 floors. Of course, the loot gets better the deeper you go, so there's always a temptation to push it, and that's part of what makes it so fun. Note that even though the Temple of Recollection does become accessible pretty early, its final set of layers only become traversable once the story mode is beaten. This means that beating the Temple of Recollection will be a post-game project. Fortunately, it manages to hit the spot quite well after the appetizer that is the story mode. For one, it's a much more satisfying challenge than the story mode. It doesn't have any actual difficulty options like the story mode does, and so that might sound as if it would be easier, but in reality, as far as I can tell, the Temple of Recollection seemingly uses a Bloody Palace style of difficulty scaling, in that the first several floors are on easy mode, the middle floors are on normal mode, and the final floors are on a difficulty synonymous with the challenge mode. Secondly, not only does the temple scratch the gameplay itch, but it also gives somewhat of a more satisfying conclusion to the story than what the actual story mode left you hanging with. Obviously, I don't want to spoil anything about that, but it is related to the secret boss, so you will just have to reach the end of the temple for yourself to see what I'm talking about there. Also, one of my favorite things about the Temple of Recollection is that it can often make you face 2 bosses at the same time that were never actually fought together in the story mode. Obviously, this is just an easy way to get extra content by recycling assets, but I wish more games would do things like this, considering there's no reason not to. It kind of reminds me of the X Challenge mode from the Mega Man X Legacy Collection, actually. For reference, my total playtime measured about 43 hours when I finally managed to beat this mode, which means it took me an additional 17 hours of almost pure Temple of Recollection gameplay after already putting some time into it during the story playthrough. Now, you don't need me to tell you that this Temple of Recollection thing lacks the sheer replayability of a Binding of Isaac, or a Dead Cells, or a Hades, but there is still some replayability to be had here. For one, you can play it with as few or as many characters as you want, and there's actually a reason to play it with fewer characters, because that nets you a bigger amber multiplier. Also, upon beating it for the first time, you unlock a list of difficulty modifiers which each increase the rewards in some way, essentially the packs of punishment system from Hades. I could imagine some people complaining about the perks offered in between rooms for not being transformative enough when they're all simple stat modifiers, but that wasn't really a problem for me because the core gameplay is already good, and also because the bond memories is where the actual transformative abilities are found. I do have some complaints about the Temple of Recollection though, even with this being the best mode, but they're all really random or peripheral. For example, the devs weirdly decided that you cannot use any spells or skills in between floors. and all the cooldowns are frozen during this time as well. So, if you always want to have as optimal of a start as possible at the beginning of every room, you should wait to finish off the last remaining enemy in the rooms prior until you have fully healed and all of your cooldowns are back. And even then, when you finish off the enemy, you should do it with a basic attack instead of a spell or skill, so you don't immediately start the next room with a cooldown at maximum wait time. But this is only really achievable when playing as a solo character, because when you play with 2 or more, the AI obviously doesn't wait. They'll just waste cooldowns on the enemy whenever possible. So that's annoying. Your party members can also drag you down even when they're dead, because for some reason the game will still offer perks to dead characters with seemingly no way to revive them. And sometimes all 3 of the offered options are for dead characters only. Maybe the devs wanted there to be some inherent risk in taking a bigger party, considering a bigger party makes it easier in general, but it just seems like an oversight to me. My other complaints are more so about general problems with the game that just get exacerbated in the Temple of Recollection, one of which being an echo of something I said earlier, and that's relating to the lack of accessible information. Specifically, here, you cannot just check your stats whenever you want. You can only see them on the level up screen. This is kind of an issue because lots of times you'll have to choose between 2 perks that both buff the same stats, but with one being a flat number increase while the other is a percentage increase. Obviously, in cases like these, you would want to check your current stats so you could math out exactly how much the percentage increase would give you and how it compares to the flat number, right? Well, if you want to do that, then you need to either memorize the level up screens of every character in your party, or you can do what I did and just take a screenshot whenever somebody levels up. But even then, you have to go back and delete all those pictures later, so it's still a problem. The other complaint is the fact that you cannot use multiple save slots in a single playthrough. The extra save slots are seemingly only for when you want to start a new game. That already sounds wrong enough as it is for an RPG, but it's especially bad for the Temple of Recollection. And to understand why, I need to finally explain something called bond resonance. So basically, the bond memory cards serve as a sort of collectathon element in this game, and as you reach certain milestones in your collection, like collect all Chapter 1 bond memories, for example, you will be rewarded with what's called a bond resonance, which is literally just a permanent buff to your stats that you cannot turn off. The reason why this makes having no extra saves worse is because, if you are like me, you would want to try beating the Temple of Recollection with minimal bond resonance buffs, or at least not many of them. So once I realized what the bond resonance thing was doing, I wanted to make a backup save that I could load just in case the bond resonances ended up being too strong and trivialized the difficulty, but I couldn't. Fortunately, the Temple of Recollection does seem to be balanced around having all of the buffs, but I would obviously like to still be able to turn them off. Or at least make extra save files, right? Anyway, I don't think I need to spend much more time explaining the Temple of Recollection because I do have a complete run posted on my channel already, so you can just go watch that to see what it's like. Just keep in mind that the only run I have uploaded right now is with a solo character, and I was doing kind of a tank build for safety, so that's why the video is 6 hours long. I don't think it's normally supposed to take 6 hours. I think I was playing the game in a slightly not intended way, but there are timestamps, and it was the first complete run to ever be documented on YouTube, so it does have some value. And last but not least is the challenge mode. Not quite as good as the Temple of Recollection, but still a lot better than the story mode. Challenge mode unlocks once you beat the story mode, but I only beat one of the challenge mode missions before deciding that I wanted to save it for after completing the Temple of Recollection. So, to keep a reference, my total playtime in general measured 48 hours upon beating the final thing in challenge mode, which means that this mode took a little more than 5 hours in total. But what is challenge mode like? Basically, it's a third difficulty option that makes the story mode a little harder, but it's not quite that, because instead of it just letting you replay the story mode on a higher difficulty, it actually cuts all the fat and essentially turns the story mode into a post-game boss gauntlet. The best part about this is that the bosses now have additional moves, when I was kind of expecting the devs to simply just up their stats and call it a day, and these new moves can even show up in the Temple of Recollection when at a deep enough layer. But other than that, there's not too much to say about challenge mode. Despite the name, it's not that hard, although I did grind for XP once in this mode, and this is the only time I ever did that in the whole game. It was because of the one mission that I already mentioned earlier, the one in which you have to play as Pop the Mage against the guy who resists magic. I didn't need to grind, but I was being stubborn and wanted to do it without using any items, and so that means I pretty much had to do it without getting hit more than a few times, which is normally no biggie for me, but considering the matchup and how long it takes to hurt him, I wanted the XP just to be able to do a bit more damage and make it go faster. So, aside from that fight in particular, the challenge mode missions give you more than enough XP to go through the whole thing and be high enough level to beat its version of the final boss, which is level 90 by the way, and I was level 77 when I beat it. There is some replayability to challenge mode considering you can do the missions with other characters once you beat them, but after beating challenge mode once, I was mostly just interested in doing more Temple of Recollection since that's where the real post-game is. I know I keep saying this, but the Temple of Recollection is indeed the main reason to buy the game. I see a lot of people complaining about the price of the game, and I would agree with them if the Temple of Recollection weren't included, but it is included, and that makes it worth the price in my opinion. Would the game be better received if it were priced a little cheaper? Probably, yeah, but in a way they kind of undersold it at the same time. Also, for anyone wondering about completion stuff, after beating the challenge mode, I went back to the Temple of Recollection to acquire the last bond memory I was missing, which only took one extra run, not even a full one. And at that point, my playtime measured 50 hours. So that would be the total time it took to beat all 3 game modes and also collect all the bond memory cards, 50 hours. Side note, beating the temple with only one character is by far the most demanding achievement for this game, and assuming that the PlayStation trophies are identical, this would be a really easy game to plat for anyone interested in that sort of thing. If you want my recommendation, here's what I'll say. If you are wanting Infinity Strash to be anything like a normal Dragon Quest game, you probably won't like it very much. But if you think the trailers look cool and if you've watched some gameplay and think it looks fun, then I say you should go ahead and get it. Especially if you are looking forward to the game and understand what its genre is, don't let any of these negative reviews stop you from enjoying it because, contrary to popular belief, the combat is actually pretty good. That's the main point I want to convey. And also, the game is so pretty. If you like anime, then I think you'll really appreciate the art style and all the big flashy super animations. But anyway, thanks again to Square Enix for providing the code. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone for watching the whole video. So, bye for now.
海の王者海戦記ボラホーン